Thank you so much for the warm intro. It's great to be back. We were here this morning, and it's great to be back and to continue having such a great crowd here for our summit. I'm thrilled to be here with Adam. Adam was introduced to us by a very close family friend. We were just talking about him backstage. Matthew, he's a great angel investor in the healthcare ecosystem. And we owe it to him and all these introductions that we get through the Angel and VC network, and have gotten to know Adam quite well over the years and his family as well, and gotten to see his success. And I encourage everyone to connect with him afterwards, and especially visiting their office and seeing their lab. So Adam, do tell us about the early days and how you started the company, and congratulations on the EY nomination. I know there's more events coming with that tonight as well, but maybe you could paint us a picture of what triggered you. What was that founder story that made you start back then Click Diagnostics, but today Visby Medical?
Yeah, thanks for having me. So, I think we can all kind of relate to how the world of healthcare really needs to change in many, many different ways. And we all have our own personal stories. Typically, when you deal with a big problem, you typically start doing those presentations with kind of just flashing very large numbers, right? How many millions of people are suffering from certain things that you're dealing with in the company. For me, rather than talking about the millions and millions of people, I typically rather tell the story about one person, and it's someone that's very near and dear to my heart. You know her, that's my daughter, Noah. And when Noah was 1.5 years old, we found ourselves in the emergency room in Stanford Medical School. She was not feeling well. It was Saturday night. She started coughing, breathing really rapidly. She threw up. And typically, if you have kids, you know that when your kids throw up, typically they feel better afterwards. So it's actually a good thing. Well, that wasn't the case here. We got nervous enough that we drove her over to the emergency department. There was a lineup of doctors and nurses that waited for us there because we called them and told them about what the symptoms were. They were worried enough that they started taking a bunch of scans of her. They took swabs from all sorts of parts of her body, sent it over to the lab, a bunch of x-rays. Now try to tell a 1.5-year-old kid that's really not feeling very well to stand still while they're taking x-rays of her chest. No way, right? Took one x-ray after another, after another, after another. I'm holding her, trying to hold her there, keep her from moving around. And kind of fast forward a couple of hours, we have a lineup of ENT surgeons introducing themselves to us. My wife and I are starting to get really nervous. Why do we have all these surgeons introducing themselves to us? We're like, what's going on? What's happening? They go, look, your daughter is not doing well. Her oxygen levels continue to walk down. Start up in the high 90s, mid 90s, low 90s. She's now in the upper 80s. That's really not good for percent oxygenation in her blood. We are worried that she might have inhaled a piece of toy that went into her lungs. We're worried enough, even though we didn't see anything in the x-rays. Remember, x-rays can see metal. So we know it's not a toy, a piece of metal or something, but it could be a small piece of plastic of some sort. And of course, we can't ask her. She's only 1.5 years old. She's barely communicating with us. So we're afraid enough that something might be there. She could develop pneumonia and literally die within hours if we don't do something. So here's what we suggest we do. We want to do what they call an exploratory surgery into her lungs. We hear this and we're almost fainting. That's our first child, and so we have no experience with kids in the emergency room. We're almost fainting, but with a little bit of conscience that we still have in us, we tell them, please don't do this. Unless it's truly not our choice, please try to monitor and figure out if there's any other way we can do it without surgery. I'll spare you the next 24 hours, but it was really a miserable 24 hours. And in the meantime, she's getting hospitalized. She's now in the Lucille Packard Children's Hospital, a very good children's hospital, hospitalized there. A round of doctors coming in every 20, 30 minutes, telling us how bad of a parents we are for not letting them operate on our child. At least that's what we heard. I didn't really say that, but that's what we heard, kind of in the place where we were. It took those 24 hours. Remember I told you that when we walked in, they took a bunch of swabs from her? Well, one of the swabs they sent over to the lab. And the lab finally came back with the result. Turns out what she had was a virus called RSV. Anybody heard of RSV before? Anybody keep your hand up if you had any experience with RSV? Okay, so it's not fun, especially if you're a very young child or if you're an elderly person. The RSV could be really, really bad. But you can live through that. It's okay. At that point, everybody calmed down. It was just RSV. There's a way to handle it. There's a way to treat it. And sure enough, nobody talked to us about surgery anymore, exploratory surgery, as they call it. And a few days later, her symptoms evaded, and she's now okay. She's a very happy 6-year-old kid. But the reason why I'm telling you this story is that this incredibly long 24 hours in the hospital that was incredibly difficult for all of us, and the amount of radiation she got from all the x-rays, not to mention the bill that we got a month later. That was about $25,000 worth of bill that truly could have been completely eliminated and avoided if they were just able to bring that big PCR machine from the lab into that emergency department and on the spot get a test and tell us she doesn't have anything in her lungs, she has RSV. Let's treat for the RSV and not deal with something else. Even better, if we could even run that test ourselves at home, just like we're all running those rapid COVID tests at home, that'll be even amazing, more amazing. So that's kind of just a cruel reminder that what we're doing is probably important.
I can't imagine having gone through that. I have a 20-month-old, so having gone through that experience with a little one, not easy, and I'm sure made you have more thicker skin with the next two that came along. But thank you so much for sharing that. And we always love to back founders that have a strong, personal story. And it's very clear, with your story that it's, quite personal. Would love to maybe change gears and talk a little bit about the types of tests that Visby Medical covers. I know initially you started in sexually transmitted diseases and testing, but with what happened during the pandemic, there was a shift with COVID testing, but would love to cover the range of testing that you do.
Yeah, so if you think about what is the fundamental challenge that we have in the world of dealing with infections, right? Infections being the bacteria, viruses, parasitic infections, doesn't matter what. The biggest problem is that when and where we need to know what we're dealing with, we don't have that result available to us. So it's really about getting both accuracy and speed at the same time, right? Not being willing to compromise one for the other. And that's a challenge. That's really across all infections, from eye infections to ear infections to respiratory infections like COVID, but others, RSV certainly being one of them, sexually transmitted infections, urinary tract infections, you name it, right? The list goes on and on. All the places where we humans get infections in the body, when and where we need to know what we're dealing with so we can actually prescribe and treat you for what you have, not for what you don't have. That's the problem. We don't have that. And that's about a $200 billion market that truly works backwards. We treat you first and we diagnose what you had later. And it makes no sense, but doctors came up with a really fancy word for it. It's called giving somebody a presumptive treatment, which is really just a fancy word of saying, I have no clue what you have, so I'm just going to guess. So what we did essentially at Visby is to say, look, there is a way to diagnose infections very accurately. It's called PCR. We've all had PCR tests, I'm sure, over the last, probably more times than we can probably want to admit, over the last year and a half or 2 years or so. And the instrument itself works really well. It's very accurate. It's just not very accessible to you when and where you need it. And that's what we did. So we basically took a sofa-sized machine and turned it into this. Right, so, and what I'm holding here is an actual PCR machine. There's no shortcuts here. This is not a antigen, antibody, something else that look and feel maybe like it. This is the real thing. It's, if you kind of look at a big Roche machine and you kind of look at what's inside here, it has very similar components running the exact same technology.
Roche is sitting in the first row.
Oh, there we go. Excellent. There we go. All right. Hello. Hi. Got a chance to know Andre Hoffman quite well over the last 3 years. It's actually one of our investors too. So one of the interesting things about this is really now you can take the same test that you would otherwise run in a big centralized lab, but just allow anybody to test it, to look for those infections anywhere, anytime. And it's not that complicated. It's maybe hard to see, and that's kind of the whole point. It's small, but once you put the sample here, you just close this lid and you press those 3 buttons, and in less than 30 minutes, you're getting an answer here. In this case, it's a sexually transmitted infection test. It's actually on the market right now. Like you said, we then, as soon as the pandemic started, we shifted our attention also to COVID. So we have a COVID test out, and there's a long pipeline now of many other tests that we're putting inside this small little platform. It's always the same physical device, just different chemistry inside.
And how do you get those tests? Like, every time I look at it, I'm like, it's convenient to maybe have them at home, but who's your customer and how do you reach them?
So the first clearance we received from the FDA is to allow for these tests, specifically our sexually transmitted infection test, to be used in a doctor's office. So that's a professional setting called CLIA-waived setting. So think urgent care centers, emergency departments, OBGYNs, family doctors, even CVS Minute clinics and other types of kind of retail clinics and so on. So that's the first setting. So for the first time now, you can walk into a doctor's office or an emergency department, and unlike that terrible experience that my wife and I had with our daughter, this time they can run the test on the spot, test you, treat you. The patient leaves knowing what they have and knowing that they've actually been treated for what they have, not what they don't have. So that's already available there. And we're running the clinical trial right now for an at-home test. And because it's a single-use disposable test, you buy it, you run it, you throw it away. It fits really well to an at-home setting. So hopefully in the next couple of years, we'll have a number of tests to also cover the over-the-counter at-home setting as well.
Excellent. And this wasn't one of the questions, but would love to maybe dive into what happened for you all in the past 2 years. I know you developed a COVID test, and you've been working with a lot of big companies in the area as well, and have successfully gotten some non-dilutive funding. If you can also speak to that.
Yeah, so obviously that's not something we wish to happen. I'll tell you one interesting anecdote. So this STD test that we just finished developing, we finished the clinical trial and just clicked the submit button to the FDA in March of 2020. The worst time to submit anything to the FDA that's not COVID related. So instead of 90-day review or 120-day, it ended up taking a little over a year and a half to review this thing. And now we knew that essentially overnight, two things happened. FDA is going to sit for a very long time to review this for all the right reasons, unfortunately. And the second thing is our market essentially got obliterated overnight because people just didn't go to doctors' offices. So even if the FDA responded very quickly, nobody was running any STD testing in doctors' offices. Nobody even went to doctors' offices. And so it was very clear that it was the right thing for all the right reasons to shift our attention and try to develop a COVID test. Are we being recorded, by the way, right now? We are. We are recorded? Okay, so I'll
And we're live.
Okay. Oh, okay. Excellent. Well, so some individuals from the U.S. government reached out to us and said, that's March of 2020, said, if you develop this very, very quickly for a COVID test, we'll support everything you're doing. Just forget about cost, forget about it. We'll support you. We'll take care of it. Some of those individuals got in pretty bad trouble for supporting testing of COVID because remember, if you test more, you end up finding more infections. So that's just a fact, I guess. And so some of these individuals got fired, and all of a sudden that disappeared immediately. But then over the next few months, we just said, look, we have to do this for all the right reasons. Unfortunately, we have excellent supporters, wonderful investors that support what we've been doing. And so we raised money, we developed our first COVID test on our own. We launched it, and then at that point, things have shifted a little bit, and the government ended up deciding that they actually do care about testing, and they actually do want to support these initiatives. And really, over the last year and a half, we received over $50 million from the US government, not just in support of the clinical trials and the results we're developing, but also helping us with other things that are really practically important, like supply chain. So we had an individual in the US government that was an expert in supply chain. Every time one of our suppliers didn't deliver on time, we would just call that person, and that person would call the CEO of that company and said, the US government is asking you to make sure that this particular purchase order for an insignificant number of dollars, right, could be a double-sided tape from some company or whatever, gets delivered to Visby Medical on time as you promised. So that was incredibly helpful, more than just the money, but also the support we've been able to get from them.
Definitely great support from the government, and also helped accelerate things quite rapidly.
Yeah.
Great. Maybe switching gears a little bit more to the funding side. I recall when we initially invested, it was a bit later stage for us, and we invested about $100K back then. But since then, you've gone on, and now you're, a unicorn and have raised over, 200 million plus. What would be kind of the story that you would share to entrepreneurs in the room on how to achieve that growth as a medical diagnostic company in the healthcare industry?
So raising money was certainly not easy over the last several years. We have a history of raising money at some of the worst times you can possibly imagine. Our Series B was in the late summer of 2015. And some of you might remember there was a very important article in the Wall Street Journal in October of 2015 that for the first time exposed Theranos really for what they really were. But the months leading into that, Theranos was all over the news, and a lot of investors told us, why do we need to invest in another diagnostic company? After all, with a single drop of blood, you can test for everything. And Theranos already got it, right? So diagnostics, check, done. And of course, once that article came out and everything that came after that, people started to get a little worried and said, maybe we don't know much about diagnostics. Maybe we should stay away from that. And unfortunately, it somewhat tainted that environment. But through that, I think a couple of important insights perhaps to share. I think one of them is there are always some investors that are willing to go enough into the details and realize that really God is in the details, and if you have real technology and a strong conviction that you're solving something that is important, that there is a way to find somebody that would be willing to take a chance on you. We certainly had that at that moment in time. That was pretty meaningful. You just mentioned the round that we've closed. In the past, sometimes we were successful enough and fortunate enough to have oversubscribed rounds. We're about to raise our Series E just earlier this year. In January, we thought we were going to have an incredibly oversubscribed round, somewhere around 3 to 4 times oversubscribed round. So it felt like great. And there must be like a green light somewhere. We press that button. It says autopilot, and off we go. Yeah, exactly. And then the round gets closed. Sure enough, the first couple of months happened in the year, and that looked terrible. And we started to have one investor after another dropping out from this round, just saying, look, we like the company, but everything that's happening now with Putin making those threats and so on is just too scary. We end up closing the round on a Friday in February, and during that weekend, Putin's troops started walking on Ukrainian soil. And one of those investors that ended up joining the round called me afterwards and said, we were really, really lucky to get everything closed that one Friday, because had we just waited for the following Monday, some risk officer would walk into this office and say, let's just pause all investments just to see how things are going. So I think and I remember in the weeks leading up to that, we already knew the round was closed. We had everyone's agreements and commitments, but the lawyers said, look, we just need a couple more weeks just to finish certain things. We said, no weeks, no months, no nothing. We're locking you all in a particular Zoom room, and we're not allowing anyone to leave that Zoom room until you sign everything, until you're all flashed out, all those insignificant things that you'd love to argue about, because we have to close this round, right? Because you just never know what can happen the next day.
Talk about good timing then. Definitely. A lot has happened the past 2 years, and a lot of hardship, I would say, this past year as well. So definitely affects, the entrepreneurs in the room. So thank you so much for being so open and sharing that. Maybe switching gears, and maybe also touching a little bit actually on the story you shared, because I think this is one of your big values within the company. I think around the same time that things were going downhill with Theranos, I came and visited your office, and you have transparency is, I feel like, if that's the word for you, but it's one of your values, and you have kind of glass walls in your labs and everywhere, and everything can be seen. Maybe you could speak to that and how that started.
So I think a lot of people talk about culture and the importance of culture, and this is just one example of why culture is so important. When we started the company, we kind of took a napkin and wrote down, like, what are some of the key themes that we want to see in our values? And we had a couple of things. The very first thing we wrote, there was no jerks allowed, and we still have that kind of hung on the wall. But one of the themes that we decided that was really important as scientists, as medical professionals, as people that ultimately do things for patients, one of our overarching values is remember there's a patient waiting. And there are two really important things in that sentence. Remember, there's a patient, so it's our obligation to do what's the right thing for the patient, to keep quality high. But also remember, there's a reason why we're doing things in the startup. There's a reason why startups can innovate so much, because patients are waiting, and we have a sense of urgency here. And finding that right balance is really important. And for us, one of the ways that we felt we could achieve that is by going to an extreme degree of transparency. So whether that's in our all-hands meetings, or whether that's just by, like you said, walking into the office and you see there's just glass everywhere. We had a board meeting in a boardroom. Everyone can look inside a board meeting. You can see people's facial expressions. If somebody's feeling sad or angry, you can see that. You can see what slides are being presented on the wall. So this kind of extreme transparency is something that just oozes out throughout the organization, and really setting an expectation of people. You're in the medical space, you take care of patients, we do things in an extreme degree of transparency, everything.
No, it's super clear from the moment you walk in, and also just interacting with you as well. Another key point on your values, and something I've observed more recently as well, is the people you've surrounded yourself with. Maybe especially with how tough it is to hire these days, and the talent pool and everyone fighting for the best people. Maybe you could speak to that as well.
Yeah, so the great resignation, as it's referred to sometimes, is certainly real, and something that we have to constantly think about. Somebody told me once that people don't leave jobs, they leave bad bosses. And so we actually had a really difficult time in 2020. So in March of 2020, we were about 70 or 80 people in the company. We finished 2020 with over 400 people in the company. And growing from 80 to 400 people in such a short period of time was a disaster. It sounds fun, it sounds exciting. There's nothing exciting about it. It's just pure misery. And the first thing that takes the biggest hit, you want to guess? What takes the biggest hit when you grow so quickly? Culture, right? Culture, communication, how do we interact with each other, all fundamentals of what you need in a really good company. And frankly, all the fundamentals that employees want when they decide to work someplace. We end up hiring so fast, so quickly from places, like our supply chain team was non-existent. We had essentially no supply chain team, but we had to develop one. We end up hiring tons of people, sometimes several people that worked in the same group in some industry somewhere. And so now you don't just hire one person and that person brings whatever beautiful culture they grew up in and so on, but they bring several of their other colleagues, and all of a sudden that's now becoming a new clique. And it's much harder for that team now to assimilate in the culture and absorb and for the culture to slowly grow and improve. We used to double our size every 18 months. That was okay. We were able to tolerate that. We were illfully unprepared for that kind of growth, and that was really hard.
No, definitely tough times to hire, and culture definitely a big piece of it, that very hard to maintain as you scale. Maybe switching gears to a fun question. I don't know how and when you have time with 3 kids, a company that you're running that's a unicorn now, to try these amazing dishes all over the world. Adam shares around Christmas time, the top dishes of food that he's had over the year. And I'm always amazed, they're from Tel Aviv to Germany to Latin America. What inspired you to start that, and where do you find the time?
So different people do different things to relax and to work on their mindfulness and find their inner calmness and so on. For me, that's cooking. I just love cooking. As a postdoc at Berkeley, I used to go back and forth between Menlo Park and Berkeley, where we lived in Menlo Park, and my postdoc in Berkeley. And I used to stop at this restaurant, and actually used to work there as a sous chef for some time, a very nice French restaurant. And so for me, cooking has always been kind of very calming. I don't have enough time unfortunately to do that. So no, second best to that is eating somewhere. But you have to invest time in yourself also, right? You have to invest time in being able to find kind of things that really calm you down and excite you and so on. So for me, food is that. And it's science ultimately.
Yeah, no, definitely. And I think anyone in the room that's interested should subscribe to his newsletter. I always look forward to receiving it, and always amazed at how you create the time, and maybe throughout your travels, you save the time to try amazing cuisine.
It's a nice thing. It's always try about finding a diamond in the rough. So it's very easy to find amazing dishes at Michelin star restaurants and so on, because somebody already found that. But finding an amazing dish that touches all the 5 basics of an excellent dish, but finding that in a hole in the wall somewhere, that's pretty cool.
Yeah, the range of restaurants is also all over the place, so covers it all. Last question in our last minute. If you have any predictions on the future of healthcare, especially when it comes to consumer-facing healthcare?
I think there are several really important trends that started before the pandemic, and it's very clear that the pandemic has only accelerated them. And I think realizing that new reality is very meaningful. So, for example, in our industry, telemedicine has been something that people have been talking about, but insurance companies really resisted that. They said, why should we be paying a doctor to see a patient on telemedicine? Would that be difficult for us? Well, it turns out the pandemic just forced that. And so telemedicine is certainly here to stay. I think patients taking ownership of their own healthcare, patients even understanding what diagnostics are, and the fact that you don't immediately jump into treatment, but there's a meaningfulness around finding out what it is that you have. Those are all sorts of lingos that people now start having. I mean, for crying out loud, my aunt the other day started telling me about the fact that there's a PCR test and an antigen test, and antigen is not as good as PCR. And like, I've been trying to tell you that for years now, and you've never listened. And now when the people are talking about it on TV, that becomes a new part of her lingo. So I think that's so there are several really important trends that just getting accelerated with patients deciding to take ownership of their own health, and I think those are really here to stay.
Well, thank you so much, Adam. The time flew by so quickly, and can't thank you enough for the time that you spent here with us today and for being an amazing part of our portfolio. And thank you, everyone, for listening.
Thank you so much.